welcome to today's show, where I'm joined by philosopher of mind, Philip Goff, or philosopher of mind and religion and other things as well, I suppose, more recently, but Philip Goff, philosopher. And we're going to be reviewing a video done by Sabine Hossenfelder, a sort of popular science YouTuber with a physics background who likes to comment on philosophical topics. And I think that it's a good combination because Philip is someone with very different views on philosophy of mind to myself, which we can talk about as we go on. I consider myself to be someone who's very skeptical of the sorts of views that Philip has, a behaviorist, a naturalist, but we both converge on criticisms of what Sabine is saying in this video. And so it's kind of, maybe a good kind of two perspectives on this thing. Anything you want to say about the video before we kind of get into it?
No, that's a very good way of framing it, I suppose. I think, yeah, I mean, well, one thing, I tweeted about this and it got quite a lot of views. And I think what struck me was that hardly anybody pushed back at me. Normally I get a lot of pushback, but hardly anyone. So I think maybe a lot of different philosophical opinions can converge on something not quite right here. If you just know a little bit about the topic, you can see there's something not quite right here, I think.
Right. So we're kind of a little bit constrained on time, so we're going to try and keep it short and brief and hit all the key points. So without further ado, let's go on the video. And just say if you want me to pause, but I'll pause at some key points as well.
Is your red the same as my red? You look at a red apple, I look at a red apple. We both wonder why we're looking at red apples, but we probably agree that the apple is red. Then again, how do we know our experiences are actually the same? For a long time, the answer was, we don't know and we won't ever know. Philosophers called it qualia, and it was supposedly something that science can't test. But scientists just went and tested it. The idea that qualia are unmeasurable comes largely from the work of philosophers.
So something I just wanted to comment on at this first point was what I saw as a kind of a rhetorical theme maybe in Sabine's presentation, which is, philosophers say this, but scientists went and did it anyway, as if the kind of two are always in tension and scientists are the ones doing all the real work, but philosophers are always these kind of confused, bumbling idiots or something. And I've got criticisms of philosophy and its methods, but I think that is not quite accurate for what's going on. I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
No, just to agree with what you say there. Yeah, that's really a good point.
Like Thomas Nagel and David Chalmers. In his famous essay, What is it like to be a bat? Nagel argued that there is something fundamentally inaccessible about another creature's subjective experience. Even if you knew everything about how a bat's brain works, you still wouldn't know what it's like to be a bat. That, according to Nagel, is the essence of qualia, the private subjective side of experience that can't be fully captured by physical descriptions. David Chalmers later expanded this idea with what he called the hard problem of consciousness, which is the idea that even if you understand all the physical processes in the brain, you still haven't explained why experience feels the way it does. This philosophical view made qualia seem almost mystical, cut off from scientific investigation. I've always thought this is bullshit.
So let's just pause before she gives her opinions. Is there anything you want to say about that characterization? Are you happy with that broadly about qualia and the hard problem, or is there anything you feel it's left out or misrepresents?
Yeah, I suppose, to be fair, it was good that she got into a little bit of the details of, Nagel. She mispronounced Nagel, but anyway, Nagel's arguments and Charm. Yeah, that was all accurate. I mean, calling it mystical and stuff is sort of a bit of a caricature, and but I suppose in the sense that these arguments are pressing that there's something outside of the domain of normal scientific methods. So yeah, not too bad so far.
And just on that, could you maybe put it sort of in your own words how you think about it? Like, because it's not exactly that there is something that is maybe in principle inaccessible to science, or that scientific methods are the wrong things for interrogating it, because you always depend on your subjective experience in order to know that thing, even if you could a posteriori sort of like establish those relationships or something. Is that like how would you kind of characterize this qualia sort of thing?
There's different ways of getting at it. I suppose what one way of saying what these arguments are trying to press is that there's a conceptual difference between the physical science description of the brain, neural firings and action potentials and stuff, and talk of subjective experience, feeling pain, seeing color. Nagel's getting at that, saying, well, look, we can know all the neuroscience of the bat, but we won't know what it's like to adopt a bat's perspective. I suppose with it'll come into the, is my red the same as your red? I suppose the thought is the neuroscience facts will sort of leave that open whether we have the same red. So in the first instance, I suppose it's an epistemological point. There's a conceptual difference. It's being alleged, and then you can go three different ways with that. You could say, no, there isn't a conceptual distinction. Shut up. Maybe you're a bit more in that camp. Maybe say it more nice. There's no conceptual distinction at all. Daniel Dennett would be like, what the hell are you talking about? Actually, the majority, by a long mile, the majority physicalist position is, yes, there is a conceptual distinction, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It's just a conceptual distinction. It doesn't mark a sort of ontological distinction. And then the third camp that I'm in will be, yes, there is a conceptual distinction, and that implies there is a ontological distinction. So actually, I mean, there is a big camp. 60% on, in the Phil Papers surveying philosophers' opinions on this, 60% said, yes, there is a conceptual distinction, a radical conceptual distinction between, if you like, qualia way of describing things and physical science way of describing things. 60% as against 16% that say there is no conceptual distinction. But then within that 60%, what is it now? 52% will say, okay, but it doesn't matter. Whereas 32% say, it does matter. There's an ontological distinction. So yeah, anyway, they're the three options. That was getting into the details a bit.
It's okay. And just a question then about what sort of methodological setup that that's consistent with in terms of what we're doing in the neurosciences and psychology. Would you say then, given your views about qualia here and the kind of conceptual landscape, that it would be possible to sort of, for people to have consistent, say, behavior of producing the language of red, in the same sort of physical circumstances, but that wouldn't actually tell you that their qualia were the same exactly, because that is only known subjectively. Is that a part of your view, or how does empirical observation kind of connect to qualia in your view?
Yeah, but it depends exactly how strong you mean in we wouldn't know. I suppose what I would say is it leaves it conceptually open. It's conceptually, all the physical facts leave it conceptually open that you might have different qualia to me, or you might have no qualia at all. You might be a zombie. And that makes it different to, let's take a contrasting case. The boiling point of water, or water changing from ice, the phase change of water from ice to liquid to gas. I've been writing about this in my new book this morning, contrasting these two cases. I think once you know the chemistry, nothing's left open conceptually. It just follows conceptually that, when they're in a rigid lattice structure, they behave in the way ice does. When there's a bit more flexibility, they behave in the way liquid water does. And then when they get over 100 degrees, once you know how the molecule's behaving, it's conceptually guaranteed it's going to behave like gas, right? So whereas I think the neuroscience facts leave it conceptually it's very different with the case of qualia. I never use that word, but seeing as she's using it, it's always left conceptually open, which is why we're left with this one. Well, why? Even when you get the neuroscience, but still, I mean, I wouldn't say we don't just go off what's conceptually guaranteed. We don't just go off it's a skeptical scenario that you're a zombie, right? Doesn't mean just because it's left conceptually open that Nathan has no qualia. It doesn't mean I don't think he's got qualia. So, I think everyone would agree, and this is maybe jumping ahead a little bit, but everyone would agree there are correlations, systematic correlations between brain states and conscious experiences. Everybody agrees on that. You don't have to do neuroscience. Just hit someone over the head, they'll lose their consciousness. But yeah, everybody agrees. This is why this is so inane, this video, for the bits we'll get to. Everyone agrees on that. It's just, okay, but what explains that? Well, maybe we should move on and get to that a bit later. But yeah, I wouldn't say. So just to summarize those two subtly different points, my view as a sort of anti-physicalist, this is the majority physicalist. It's conceptually open that you've got no qualia once you've got all the neuroscience facts in. But secondly, that doesn't mean I think you've got no qualia. So I agree, like almost everybody, that there are systematic connections between conscious experiences and brain states.
Yeah. I think that's important because we're going to talk about some studies and stuff in a second, and just to understand how people should maybe interpret what those studies are saying, right, as they're kind of brought up as evidence of a view.
You can measure what's going on in the brain. Therefore, you can study what experience means in scientific terms. You cannot, of course, yourself experience the same as some other person or bat or carrot because you don't have the same brain. But give it some time and we can find the next closest approximation to someone else's experience that works on your circuits. And in a fascinating new study that just came out...
So just to pause on that point, I mean, it seems to me that there's a kind of question begging going on in the way that this is being introduced, which is to say, it's kind of like that there's a kind of hidden premise maybe about what the relationship between the brain and experience is of something like physical reduction of experiences. And it's not that I object to that in principle, but I think that a more cautious approach here would be to say, what we're doing is we're placing, depending on the experimental setup, we're placing certain types of observations, so verbal behavior reports of subjects maybe about colors, or observations, using brain imaging scanners with, between subjects, and we're comparing them, right, in response to stimuli. But none of this, without some kind of further theoretical assumption, is telling us about the private side of that. I mean, for example, you need a theory of what it means for someone to be producing a verbal report of a read experience or something in order to connect that to some kind of claim about qualia or something. Is that, I mean, that's sort of how I think about what's being said here. And I think that's where she's going a bit beyond what just the science says or something, but maybe you think about it a bit differently.
Depends how you interpret what you're saying. I mean, I again just took it to be saying a statement of correlation that, people don't have these experiences because they don't have, they have different brains, things going on in their brain. And yeah, I would say that's uncontroversial. I mean, maybe it depends, what you mean by experiences. Again, someone like Daniel Dennett would have a very different understanding of talk of experiences than someone like me, or and then there's the mainstream physicalist position in the middle. But if it just means, that what experience you have correlates with what's going on in your brain, I'd say that's uncontroversial. I mean, what she might have been getting at there is this sort of thinking that anti-physicalists would deny that. She's saying, well, they don't have the experiences, but that's only because of what's going on in their brain. Like if you look at my debate with Sean Carroll, his in my view, misunderstand, and the view of Frank Jackson, who came up with the knowledge argument, his understanding of the knowledge argument, that it's, don't know if we want to get into this, but like, we think Mary doesn't know what it's like to see red from the neuroscientific facts. And he says, well, that's just because she doesn't have the right kind of experience. And it's almost like us anti-physicalists are thinking, if physicalism is true, she ought to have the experience just by reading the brain science. But that's not what we're claiming. I mean, that night when I did that debate, all of the philosophers in the audience were like, Sean Carroll isn't getting this, isn't understanding how this argument works. It's a nuanced argument, a knowledge argument, and people think they hear the story and think, oh, I get the argument, but it's a sort of nuanced argument. The claim is rather supposed to be, well, if physicalism were true, she ought to know what it's like to see red without having the experience. So it's not that reading the neuroscience should give us the experience. It's that she ought to have all the information just from reading the neuroscience, and it seems she doesn't. She has to have the experience. Anyway, I mean, that maybe it seems something like that. She's hitting that sort of slightly misunderstanding how these arguments are supposed to go. Now, there's still lots of ways you can respond to that argument. I'm not saying once you realize this misunderstanding, then the argument works.
Yeah,
there's still lots of debate, but I do think among scientists, and for some reason Patricia Churchland is the only philosopher who misunderstands the knowledge argument in this way. And Frank Jackson emailed me after I had a Twitter discussion with Patricia Churchland on this and said, she misunderstands the argument. Anyway.
So like to highlight, like, say, one of the ways that this isn't to like say adjudicate which view is right or whatever, but like say that might even drive you away from physicalism if you think physicalism is maybe the idea that a language, say, represents the world semantically, and so a complete description would be like a complete representation of all the facts, and so you wouldn't be able to have all of the facts without having all the consciousness facts or something like that. And what I'm saying is that might then drive, if you think that that's embedded within physicalism, it might drive you away from physicalism, but you might remain a naturalist or something like that. And that's, say, how I would think about that case. Not to say that, again, there's not further things that can be said about that. But I'm wondering, in terms of what you're saying then, is it that these neuroscientific explanations, they're not sufficient for a complete explanation of what's going on with respect to when someone's genuinely having an experience or something like that? Is that the kind of crux of the issue from your point of view? That knowing everything about the brain states, the stimuli and stuff like that, it's not sufficient as an explanation?
Well, here's the right. So keep coming back to like what's not controversial. Not controversial is there's correlation here, right? Systematic correlation between brain activity and consciousness. And you get people again and again saying on social media, oh, well, that proves physicalism. Well, no, because the question is why? Why do those correlations obtain? So maybe to make this clearer, let's just get up the different explanations in their crudest forms. So physicalist explanation in its simplest form is there's an identity here. The experience just is the brain state or the pattern of neural firings. They're just one and the same thing. So that's why they correlate. That's why they go together. It's like, why does water correlate with H2O? Well, they're just the same fucking thing. That's why they correlate, right? So that's the physicalist explanation. Or David Chalmers' dualist explanation is that they're totally different, the conscious state and the brain state. Okay, well, why are there these systematic correlations? He postulates these special fundamental laws of nature, which he calls psychophysical laws. So the mental is totally different from the physical. He's a dualist, but they're hooked up with these special laws of nature. So he calls himself a naturalistic dualist. So that's why there's a correlation. They're totally different, but they're tied together. Or the panpsychist explanation, which you could think of as again a kind of identity, but then we'd say, well, the only reason you get consciousness is because, so there's sort of an identity between between my conscious feeling of pain, say, and a certain brain state, but the only reason the brain state embodies consciousness is because it's made up of conscious particles or something. So you see there's three different explanations of the same data point that the systematic correlations. Now, maybe we carry on at that point, but so I would say, that's the distinction. Correlation, uncontroversial. Why does that correlation obtain? Controversial.
Great. Let's play this on then a little bit and see how Sabine unpacks that.
Experience that works on your circuits. And in a fascinating new study that just came out a few weeks ago, scientists say that it might actually be possible to measure qualia, or at least compare them in a meaningful way. The authors of the new paper recruited 35 participants and showed them different colors while measuring their brain activity using fMRI. Their goal was to find out if the experience of specific colors, like red or blue, creates consistent patterns in the brain. They compared the brain signals across participants and indeed found similarities that match the perception of the same colors. This is the first time scientists have objectively measured qualia, subjective experiences, by identifying neural signatures that are the same for different people seeing the same color. In other words, they demonstrated that your red is, at least structurally and approximately, likely indeed the same as my red.
Okay, so maybe just to pause there. So the problem here is that there's a number of things going on, and even with the description, Sabine wasn't particularly clear. So there's three main papers that I came across behind this. One's a 2023 paper that sort of tries to establish the methodology. And what the methodology is it's basically showing colors to participants as a visual stimuli and seeing what sorts of relationships they report about those colors. So for example, you place two colors in front of someone and ask them to rate the similarity or dissimilarity on like a numbered scale. That's the methodology. So, like, for example, the red and blue that you can see here, you could have those as like standardized samples, and you've got this scale and you say, where do they lie in terms of similarity or dissimilarity? And the idea is that by mapping this out for sort of like all of the colors or something, you can do that for a bunch of different individuals. And if people rate the same differences, then they have the same, well, the paper claims, the same experience or qualia. I would say they have the same behavior. And I think that the kind of qualia thing would maybe be a step beyond what the science is showing there. So then what the fMRI paper does is it takes this methodology and puts people in brain scanners while they do, undergo this task. And it says, here's something else that's going on. The same regions of the brain are showing, increased metabolic activity via oxygenation. And then again, how I would interpret that is to say, so people have the same physiology behind their behavior. But again, I wouldn't say that that's necessarily telling me anything about qualia. But I don't know if maybe there's a different angle that you would want to kind of come at some of that stuff from.
Yeah, again, it's maybe if she's thinking it's answering this problem of, it's a thing, isn't it, that for what it's worth, philosophically inclined young teenagers start thinking, oh God, what if my red is different to what your red is? And I remember having that myself, and my big brother and my big cousin discussing this with them when I was very little, and this was very exciting. I remember I said, could it be the same with shape? And they said no. And I was still there, could it be? Anyway, but this is supposed to be a sort of skeptical thought experiment, right? Like, you could be a zombie. Like, maybe I'm in the Matrix. It's supposed to be that kind of skeptical thought experiment. And it's supposed to reveal in terms of its work in these arguments, it's supposed to reveal this conceptual distinction, right? The thought is that the fact that we can entertain these skeptical possibilities reveals that there's a conceptual distinction between, that's the argument, consciousness stuff and physical stuff. You couldn't do that kind of skeptical thought experiment with this phase change of water, right? You couldn't say, well, I know all the molecule facts, but maybe water doesn't behave in the ice-like way at that temperature. You know, it seems to just sort of conceptually guarantee. So it's supposed to be this kind of skeptical thing. It's not supposed to say, oh, we don't really know if you're seeing the same thing as red, right? And she's treating it like that. So I think, like, yeah, if it shows that you've got exactly the same brain activity when you see red, then I think, you know, in terms of what we actually know about reality, yeah, we'd say you see the same thing. You have the same experience of red. Fine. And so it's back to that uncontroversial correlation stuff. So I think she's just misunderstanding how this is supposed to function. It's not supposed, with this, it's called inverted spectrum, as you know, like, could my red be different? It's not supposed to be saying, like, is that actually true? It's supposed to be saying, we can entertain this skeptical scenario, and that shows there's a conceptual distinction. And people like me think that conceptual distinction ultimately marks an ontological distinction. Most physicalists will say, yes, it shows as a conceptual distinction, but it doesn't matter, right? So it's just like, you know, it's like saying, here's an analogy I've just thought of. It's like saying, we've proved we're not in the Matrix because scientists have observed, you know, I don't know, anything, a table.
It's like, I refute it thus, you know, the idealism thing. I refute it thus and kick in the rock. Yeah.
Yeah, so people don't know that, what's his name? Samuel Johnson famously responded to the idealist Bishop Berkeley by saying, I refute it thus and kicking a stone. So refute, unlike the way we tend to use it now, refute doesn't mean I deny, it means I prove it to be false. It was a misunderstanding of Berkeley on his part, actually, because Berkeley thought stones exist. He thought they're made of ideas, but he thought they exist. So anyway, but yeah, that's a brilliant analogy. So it's like, no, it's like if we're in the mode of just setting skepticism on one side, then we don't need to prove we're not in the Matrix. If we're taking skepticism seriously, then you're not going to refute it just by saying, "Oh, I've seen a table." So so maybe carry it over here. Like, once we're setting skepticism on one side, then of course people with the same brain activity have the same experience. That's not, oh, this has been solved by science. But once you're in this entertaining the skeptical idea that what I see as red is different to you, what you see is, then you're not going to rule it out just by some observation of the brain. So that's, I think, thanks. That's I think the nice way of seeing what's going on here.
And just being wary of your time as well. If you need to drop or anything,
let's go for half past. I'll just mean I've less time answering my emails, but people can wait. I'm having too much fun.
And just a quick question then for your view and interpretation of this. Then I'm wondering that that kind of conceptual possibility of the two coming apart, in terms of your interpretation of these people having similar reports and similar physiological states as they're producing those reports. I mean, as you've said, right, like that's sort of expected on your view. It's not like you've used the denial that would be an observation that you'd make. But I'm wondering, would you say that in these cases, it's actually possible, even in this actual case, that their subjective experiences actually do differ from one another in various ways, even though with identical behavior reports and with identical very similar behavior reports, identical very similar physiological reports? Or would you say you actually think that the subjective experience is probably very similar, or like kind of supervenes on those physical states in some sense? Like how are you thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say it's conceptually possible that they have very different states, or that they have no experience at all. But still, if they're having the same experience, I would say that's bloody good evidence that they're having the same experience. So again, it's back to that sort of uncontroversial fact. I think, that's, I mean, it'd be, I don't know, you'd have to look into exactly. And, there is actually, Ned Block has done interesting work saying that, there are actually slight color differences between different races, I think, did he look into, and gender and race.
I've not seen this.
I might be getting that wrong now. I remember I reviewed his collection of essays a long time ago, and I don't quote me on that, but I think there might be slight differences in how we see colors, and so it's an empirical question. I think I'd just be like anyone and say, if they're having the same experience, if the brain activity is the same, then that's very good evidence that it's the same experience.
Right.
And then
it's the metaphysical, the conceptual possibility thing is in your metaphysical theorizing, but it's not in your interpreting or handling of data like this.
Yeah, it's more, it does work in how you explain the correlation, but I'll just take the standard view on the evidence for the correlation that, same brain activity, same. I mean, there's all sorts of complexities. I'm just thinking of another Ned Block point of how do you know whether what is relevant is the neurophysiological details of the brain state or something more higher level, something more software-ish, something more functional. So if you had a futuristic robot that was sort of functionally the same as us, but had very different neurophysiology, maybe it's sort of made of silicon or something, would it have the same experiences or not? How would Ned's Block's paper, the even harder problem of consciousness, he's sort of saying, how could we ever establish which? So there's all sorts of complexities, but okay, what's the relevant thing here? What's the relevant commonality? But setting that on one side, I don't think as an anti-physicalist I would necessarily have a different view from anybody else on the correlation question, which factors in here, because it's like, is someone having the same brain activity, having the same experience? Yes.
Right, so let's carry on with the video a little bit then, but I need to just put it in a different window and I need to come back to that. There we go.
At least structurally and approximately, likely indeed the same as myred. This experiment is part of a broader shift in how we think about consciousness and qualia. It's a move away from philosophy to something that can be scientifically measured, quantified, and understood. For example, in another recent study, the neuroscientist Seth and co-authors have proposed a mathematical framework for consciousness in general and qualia in particular. They propose that subjective experience comes from our brains trying to constantly make predictions about what it expects to perceive.
Just something I want to say about this sort of thing as well, in terms of science communication, is that I kind of don't like it when people sort of flash up, like technical symbolism and stuff when it's not being explained what it's doing. I think that it has kind of like the hallmarks of it can persuade people because they're like, well, that looks like science, but without it actually, without them really being in a position to evaluate if it's doing something. So that that's just a presentation point. And
although I remember a quick anecdote, a conference where I was the only philosopher, a load of scientists, and I was doing my talk, and I just kept getting interrupted and saying, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? And then I had it was a bit disconcerting. Normally, you give a talk and then you get Q&A. And then I had a slide with an equation on.
Okay.
And I went through the equation, and then it was just silence. Everyone was happy after that. And there's still controversial things here.
Yeah.
So anyway.
No, I get you. I think it depends on the audience.
No, it wasn't disputing your point. It was just an excuse to tell that anecdote.
I think it just depends on the audience, and I think like what Sabine's doing is like popular science presentation, and I think if you're going to do that, you got
based on past experiences. Then it compares these predictions to the actual sensory input. When there's a difference, the brain updates its model to better match reality. In this description, qualia are the key elements of this predictive algorithm. They use experience that are particularly versatile at describing sensory input, like color, for example, or the orientation of your body standing upright or hanging upside down from a cave. Seth and his colleagues argue that if we understand how this prediction and correction process works, we might be able to map subjective experiences, or qualia, in the same way the recent study mapped color experiences. And it's not just academic curiosity. There's even an institute dedicated to this very question. It's called the Qualia Research Institute, and their goal is to create a precise mathematical framework for understanding subjective experience. They want to map the state space of consciousness, that is, they want to understand the landscape of experience. Even philosophers are coming around.
So maybe just to pause on that point, I mean, one thought I had watching this was, I wonder how scientific they are. Will they fund me to try and prove all their works wrong? But in terms of what's being said here about what Anil Seth is doing, I guess it's going to be a sort of similar problem to before, right? In that you probably wouldn't object on your view to the idea that you can map out the functionality of what's going on in the brain, the causal relationships between the brain and behavior and those sorts of things. Though, and maybe in principle, you could say, you know, when someone has qualia, there's this correlation to this region of the brain being activated or something like that. But that's not actually, that's not completely explaining why it is that that region of the brain being activated or playing this functional role is what it's like to have an experience or something. Is that how you would characterize that, like similar to what's going on?
Yeah,
before?
I think what they're doing is correlation stuff, and you know, and Anil has his own philosophical take on that. You know, I get on very well with Anil, and we've had, you know, a few public discussions, and you know, so his philosophical take on that is, oh, we just keep doing the correlational stuff. He calls it the real problem of consciousness, and eventually we'll stop worrying about the hard problem. Okay, that's his philosophical take on it. But you know, you could work on that project with him. I don't know the philosophy of his co-writers, you know, and be a panpsychist like me or a property dualist like Chalmers. You could have a different philosophical take. So I think we need to just divide up the kind of scientific task of establishing these correlations from the philosophical task of what explains these correlations. I mean, there's a slight nuance here, so that just seeing as we're talking about Anil, that he wants to say he is doing some explaining. Mm-hmm. And I thought about this a long time. One of the times I debated him, and I think what I would say he's, you know, because he's not just purely giving explanations, you know, the predictive processing stuff. Sorry, he's not just purely giving correlations. The predictive processing stuff feels sort of more explanatory, and I would say he's sort of giving potential explanations, you know, right, that you'd, once you fill in the metaphysical story of physicalism or dualism, then it would be a complete explanation. And I see. That would be my view. But yeah, I think what they're doing here is standard stuff that everyone would agree on. It's not answering the philosophy. There's those two different tasks. There's the scientific task of the correlations and the philosophical task of what explains the correlations. Now, look, you could just say, you know, well, that philosophy thing's a load of bollocks, right? But okay, I mean, it would be nice for Sabine to sort of engage the arguments and say why it's rubbish. Mm. But even if you think, well, it's so obviously rubbish, you don't even need. Okay, fine, but don't sort of pretend science has solved it, right? Yeah. Well, there's some new experiment that solved it. Just say it was always a load of rubbish, and we'll just get on with the science. Fine, but it's not like science is. You know, so look, there's the correlation question and there's the explanation question. I suppose you could do that in two ways. You could say, well, the only real question is the correlation question. So the other, or you could say, well, the physicalist explanation is obviously the correct one. You know, there's just an identity. All right, and I mean, I would dispute both of those,
Yeah.
but even if you say that, it's not like the science has answered it. You just think the philosophy is either a completely confused enterprise, or it's just sort of obvious which answer is correct. But it's not like the science has solved the philosophy, which is how she's presenting it with her delivering a parcel.
And so would you phrase it to say something like all of these like metaphysical theories, they're all empirically adequate, right? And so you need to do something else or something.
Yes, pretty much. But I mean, as always, there's a bit of nuance that, like, maybe if you're an interactive dualist, then it's going to be slightly empirically different. That, you know, if you think that the soul is messy, and, you know, stuff I've debated with Sean Carroll, that he thinks, you know, I just examined a PhD on this topic. I'd like to, well, maybe it's.
Is it? Yeah, you don't have to. Yeah. You can do it at some point. You don't have to sort of. You know, like
anyway, there's good things to go do. So maybe certain forms of these views could have empirical differences, but then you can have epiphenomenalist dualism where consciousness is non-physical, but it doesn't do anything, and then that would be absolutely empirically equivalent to physicalism, because the consciousness isn't doing anything; it's not changing the brain. So yeah, anyway, broadly speaking. I've forgotten the question now. Broadly speaking,
empirical adequacy, like or the metaphysical.
They're all empirically identical in terms of their predictions. And so this is it's this ongoing thing that people say, oh, you know, there are these correlations that proves physicalism, or you know, people say to, you know, how do you test panpsychism? They say, well, it's got the same predictions as physicalism. So I mean, you could say. I just don't know which is true, right? Because they've got the same predictions, we don't know which is true. But, you know, that's one option. But then don't say, well, physicalism is true. So they've all got the same. It's maybe a little bit like the situation in quantum mechanics, where the different interpretations are, roughly speaking, empirically equivalent. Again, there's some nuances here, but there's different theories that are empirically equivalent. And so, you know, Sabine tells us this data. It's like, okay, fine, that's compatible with all of our theories. Anyway,
I think that it's a reemergence of that like rhetorical theme of scientists are, you know, making progress even against what the philosophers are saying, and the philosophers are trying to hold us back. And, you know, she wants to present science, and I think science is this as an enterprise of intellectual curiosity, theory testing, trying to learn new things. But I think that what she's exhibiting in her engagement with these questions is kind of the opposite. It's a kind of dogmatism and dismissive attitude, and not kind of exploring what other theories have to say, and you know, following them through to the being in a place where you can clearly explain what's gone wrong, rather than kind of like just appeal to dismissal and authority or something.
I mean, you know, the better way of doing this is what Anil does, or what Sean Carroll does, you know. So the Anil's thing of, you know, let's just get on with the science. And he feels the pull of the hard problem intuitions, but he's got these, he just thinks it'll probably go away. And then I would say Sean's a bit more on the sort of less feeling the pull of those intuitions, sort of saying they don't make sense. Okay, fine. But, you know, it's just, I suppose part of this is about respectful engagement with peers, and see where they're coming from on these difficult questions. Or, I mean, even if you don't want to do that, even if you just think, no, this is such a load of nonsense, we'll say, I mean, at least engage with it enough to say it's nonsense, or
you should be able to clarify it. You should be able to clarify why you think that.
You should be able to clarify it. Or even if you just can't be bothered with it, it's just ridiculous to say experiments of a trust test. It's just ridiculous. Yeah, that's it. Anyway.
Right.
Is they want to understand the landscape of experience. Even philosophers are coming around to the idea that maybe, just maybe, subjective experiences aren't as philosophical as they once thought. In fact, there's a new book called The Metaphysics of Color from two philosophers that make a surprising argument. Colors are real.
We argue that there is no good reason to think that colors are less objective than, say, temperature.
What does all of this mean? If these research
I suspect that what they mean by real is also probably potentially different to what Sabine means by like scientific or something like that. It would be, my guess is they mean something about like a semantic thesis and correspondence and intentionality and like carving nature at the joints. I've not read this book yet, but like maybe natural kinds or something like that, as opposed to maybe what Sabine might mean, which is susceptible to scientific inquiry, or scientists could converge on an answer around them or something. But I don't know.
I wonder what it's gonna be. It's gonna be a more interesting thesis than that, isn't it? It's gonna than what Sabine is talking about. I mean, it might be. I would suspect maybe they mean colors. It's different view of what colors are. David Chalmers talks about Edenic color, by which he means it's like a sort of joke that color as it was in the Garden of Eden, where it's sort of the color, the real reddish quality is really out there on the surface of objects. I mean, it's the thing that Galileo in the 17th century stripped from the physical world to have mathematical physics. He thought, we can't capture that Edenic color, as to use Chalmers terminology, in mathematical language, so we stripped that out. And so some people would say, okay, Edenic color doesn't exist, like color as we ordinarily experience it, but something exists, the wavelength of light, and we can call that color. And it's a bit like the debate on free will, I suppose, that a fairly common position is that maybe our ordinary understanding of free will is something closer to libertarianism, and that doesn't exist, but there's a sense of free will that does exist that's near enough, or something like that. So maybe they're sort of starting from there and saying, no, we think Edenic colors really exist. That might be what's going on. But I'll have to look into what exactly they're saying. But it's not going to be. I mean, I don't know. What do we say of colors? There's those different options on color, a bit like free will. That it's something metaphysically hardcore and it really exists. It's something metaphysically hardcore and it doesn't exist, or it's something reductive, metaphysically lightweight. And whatever they're doing, it's going to be something interesting in that vicinity, I would bet. And she's just sort of blurring over all those different options.
Researchers are right, then we might be on the edge of a new way to understand how experience happens, and eventually also how to create it. Because imagine how amazing it'd be if you could share experiences with other people, or bats. I mean, who wouldn't want to know how it feels to breed a new human pandemic? To me, science is more than a profession.
I found that kind of curious when she said, wouldn't it be weird if you could share experiences with other people? And the reason I found that weird is because I sort of think that that's exactly what we do with language all the time. That's the reason that we have fiction and art and way we communicate with people, don't turn the shower down, it's really hot in there kind of thing. We do communicate experiences with people. You don't want to run a marathon. It's really painful those last 10 miles or something. So I just kind of thought it was like that. To me, even seems to be a part of the explananda of this subject area, right? Is we do share our what's going on when we do this thing of sharing experiences with each other. What's the ontology? What's the explanatory story? But maybe you think a bit differently. I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And you're making me think it's almost as though she's getting on the anti-physicalist side now, because the anti-physicalists would tend to think, yes, we'll never know what it's like to be a bat until we can change our brains and have the experience. That's the anti-physicalist position, isn't it? That the neuroscience doesn't
about how to share experiences and things.
It doesn't convey the character of the experience. A congenitally blind neuroscientist will never understand the qualitative character of a red experience. That's what I would think. We'll never know what it's like to be a bat, if you could change your brain and have the experience. So that's why it's supposed to be, my view, some information neuroscience isn't giving you because it's not giving you the qualitative character of a read experience. But she seems to be agreeing with that. Yes, we can't get this from reading neuroscience. We have to actually have the experience. Gets back to that. Yeah, it's that nuance. Everyone agrees you won't have the experience. The question is that I think Sean in our debate, Sean Carroll in our debate, is do you get all the info? Do you get all the info, or is there some information that you can only get when you actually have the experience? The anti-physicalist would say, yeah, you only have the info when you actually have this experience and inspect its character. And it's almost like she's agreeing with that at this point.
Yeah.
And I suppose she'd say, I imagine she'd say, but it's changes in your brain, so this is about the science. But again, it's just back to that. Everyone agrees what kind of experiences you have depends on what's going on in your brain.
Yeah, the metaphysical, there's like definitely some metaphysical sort of claims that are being just kind of embedded in what she's saying, but sort of brushed over and not argued for or something.
Want to know how it feels to breathe?
I think it's just the advert now, isn't it? Is it?
Yeah.
Oh no. Yeah.
I think so. I'll just play it for a second and see, and then if we get to the advert, I'll stop it.
To me, science is more than a profession. It's a way to understand the world and how to solve problems. This is why
Yeah, so that's advert for Brilliant. So yeah, that's the video.
Yeah, I mean it's sad in a way because I think she's an interesting public intellectual. She's done some really interesting stuff. I think her objections to fine-tuning are good, actually. I'm obviously on the other side of the debate. But the kind of thing she pushes about, she had a debate with Luke Barnes on fine-tuning about, can we make sense of these probabilities? And I don't know whether it's chasing views on YouTube. I feel like a lot of YouTube channels have, not yourself, Nathan, have sort of degraded chasing views,
I don't know which channels you could be talking about.
It's understandable, I suppose, isn't it? If people are making their living off this,
Yeah.
then I have spoken to so many. Again, not mentioning names. I've spoken to quite a few fairly big YouTube channels when I've been interviewing them, saying, "I wish I could do different stuff to what I do most of the time, but it doesn't get views and I don't make money."
Yeah.
So I don't know whether it's a bit of that. It's just I don't know. It's just. I think she's doing good, she's a good public intellectual, and it's a shame when it gets to this. I met Sabine once at the How the Light Gets In festival and tried to chat to her, and she didn't seem to want to. She seemed quite nervous actually, and she seemed, I don't know. She said, "Oh, I got to do on my YouTube channel," and I don't know. Anyway, that was before we had big bust ups on Twitter. But anyway, I've just torn a tea bag apart in my pocket. Stop. I think I think she's got a lot to contribute, and it would be good if she went back to some respectful disagreement.
Yeah, I think you can put it down to maybe some of her biases combined with maybe just trying to get a lot of content out and having a production team that's not like vetting everything or being as careful and trying to give the audience what they want. And those things just combine to maybe being a little bit incautious or overstating, the case or something like that.
Yeah.
In terms of just Mind Chat, is Mind Chat coming back anytime soon? Can people look forward to that?
Yeah, we've just both been overwhelmed by different things. I'm just sort of trying to got a book deadline for the end of this summer that's kind of capturing me. But do you think we should do some more?
Absolutely, yeah. I miss Mind Chat.
It's been a while. Oh, thanks, Nathan. Yeah, we should do. Thanks for trying and get that back together again. It's just everyone YouTube's getting. I think it gets so much more professional looking these days, doesn't it? And can't be bothered editing videos and stuff.
Yeah. I know what you mean. I think it'd be good. Did you upload them as podcast episodes as well? Because I think that would do quite well for those too.
Yeah, that was Keith's job.
Okay.
I always used to ask him, say, "You haven't done it, this one." But yeah, neither of us are great with technology. But yeah, we should get back to that, I think.
But for people who want more Philip Goff, you've got your own channel with some things on, but Mind Chat's where you've got a bunch of interviews, and obviously you've got a bunch of books and things out. Is there a best place people can go to get those from yourself?
My website, philipgoffphilosophy.com. I've got all the videos, popular articles, academic articles up there. Update that quite regularly now to try and my books, Why, The Purpose of the Universe, Galileo's Error, Consciousness and Fundamental Reality, if you want the full-blooded academic boring stuff, and like to argue on Twitter and Bluesky. But wait, what do you do? All the liberals have gone to Bluesky, and I'm doing both.
I'm doing both, but Twitter is obviously increasingly cursed. But it's
just getting all these stupid fake things, and
it's just overran
it's so
with.
Sad, isn't it? So sad. But yeah, I'm Philip_Goff on Twitter, Philip with 1 L, and then just Philip Goff on Bluesky. But yeah, I enjoy watching the different reactions you get to different posts on on those two. Yeah, if you say something slightly woke on Twitter, it just explodes.
The account called Trad West will be replying to you with some weird claims about
Trad West. What's that?
Or just like the sort of standard bot accounts and things that you get, it'll be like traditional West, and they'll be like, you're saying this because
We're both pretty woke, aren't we, Nathan? I think we're closer politically than on metaphysics.
I think so. Yeah, I mean, my political views are equally. People find them odd, I guess, because there's some sort of like strands of conservatism in there in terms of liking tradition and stuff. But I actually quite like that because it can undermine what conservatism might mean to people these days, because it can frame it in terms of like obligations and duties to society rather than, and so there's an obligation to help people, if you have a lot of money, to give that money back or to pay your taxes and help contribute and stuff, rather than, maybe more kind of libertarian versions and laissez-faire capitalist ideas in conservatism. But
I guess I'm small c conservative in some ways. I think I would have been a centrist in the post-war years, at least on domestic economics. I think I would have been a centrist, but I think on domestic economics, things have gone so far to the right since Thatcher Reagan that now I'm a radical. But I just think, the post-war years, we had kind of semi-socialism. We had taxes of 89% at the top, strong trade unions, highly regulated movements capitalists, and it worked bloody well. And it massively shared out wealth, and it was the most dynamic economy we've ever had. So you can make it like a conservative case. Like, I can understand the conservative thing of it might not work, but we tried it, and it worked for 30 years. And then we tried this Thatcher Reagan stuff. Maybe that would have worked, but it's been a disaster.
But all the one generation of people all got very cheap houses and very rich, so it worked for them. And they still
my bloody boomers, isn't it? And did amazingly well, and then they all voted Brexit, the bastards. Anyway. Oh no!
Well, appreciate you coming on, Philip. Appreciate you coming on, giving up some of your time to do this on very short notice.
Oh no, thanks for being flexible. I kept cancelling you, and I better go check my emails.
Yeah, I'll end the stream there. Thank you everyone for watching. See you around.
Thanks, Nathan.